Okay, somebody muted me. So I'll start again in case I was muted all the time. I apologize. These are the beauties of remote technology. So so again, we are now live, and I'm very pleased to start this interactive webinar organized by the Permanent Mission of Thailand to the United Nations in Geneva about the need for an international pandemic treaty, a very sort of topical and lively issue right now. My name is Gianluca Burci. I'm an adjunct professor of international law at the Graduate Institute in Geneva and former legal counsel of WHO, and I'm very pleased to be the moderator of this event. So I will now give the floor for a short welcoming remarks. The first remark, which has been video recorded, is by Mr. Thani Tompakti, who is a Permanent Secretary for Foreign Affairs of Thailand. And I would appreciate if you could project his recorded statement.
Excellencies, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, Sawadee krap. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome all of you to this interactive webinar on the need for an international pandemic treaty. First, I would like to thank all distinguished participants for the overwhelming interest in this topic. My appreciation in particular goes to His Excellency, Mr. Jagan Chapagen, Secretary General of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, for kindly accepting to give introductory remarks. Secondly, I wish to thank all the distinguished speakers joining us today. Special thanks also extend to our moderator, Professor Burci, and the Permanent Mission of Thailand to the United Nations in Geneva for spearheading this initiative. Ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by quoting UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who during the Think 20 summit in Milan earlier this month said that the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated beyond doubt that our current systems and frameworks are not fit for purpose. They urgently need upgrading. This webinar thus comes at a critical juncture. It aims to provide a forum where fresh ideas and new perspectives can be put forth to enrich the discussions of UN member states. With the UNGA in session now in New York and the upcoming special session of the World Health Assembly in late November, open and frank discussions will contribute to an informed decision by WHO member states whether there is a need for a pandemic treaty, and if so, which elements will be included in such an instrument. While leaving this discussion to experts, it is clear that our current systems and frameworks urgently need upgrading in order to provide a better response to all, especially vulnerable groups and others in need. During the next 90 minutes, diverse angles and different aspects will be addressed from our speakers, including from the WHO, the lead organization for handling this COVID-19 crisis, the South Center, an international organization acting for the Global South, the IFRC, a key actor in providing humanitarian assistance on the ground, and a fresh perspective to link Geneva and New York from Thailand's candidate for the International Law Commission for the term from 2023 to 2027, our first woman candidate for the ILC and the only woman candidate from the Asia-Pacific group. I hope this webinar will spark constructive dialogue and contribute to informed decisions by all states on the question of the need for international pandemic treaty. I look forward to a lively and fruitful discussion. Thank you. Khop khun mak krap.
So many thanks to Mr. Tompakti for his remarks, and I'm now very pleased to give the floor to Mr. Jagan Chapagen, Secretary General of the IFRC, for his introductory remark. Mr. Chapagen, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Excellency, Mr. Thani Tompakti, distinguished representatives, dear colleagues, thank you so much for inviting me to this interactive webinar on this very important and timely topic, only six weeks away from the special session of the World Health Assembly. It has been encouraging to hear in recent discussion with the member states that action, reform, and greater investment in pandemic preparedness are critical priorities, and that there is a commitment to improve on existing legal instruments that will guarantee a more effective and equitable approach to future crises. The International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, as you know, we have 192 national societies as a member and 14 million volunteers. We were born in the aftermath of the 1918 flu pandemic. So we have a history that has been associated with the pandemic. We have been fighting epidemics and pandemics alongside governments and communities ever since, through Ebola, Zika, SARS, dengue, measles, and of course now COVID-19. Public health emergencies are our past, our present, and unfortunately, we will face them again. But this time, for the future, we must be better prepared. The COVID-19 response has been hugely impaired by gaps in global cooperation and inequities affecting some of the most vulnerable of our societies. This is our collective opportunity to address this for the next time. We need bold new solutions, both in international and domestic laws, to avoid the same mistakes that has happened now and that happened in the past. Any new legal instrument, be it a treaty or otherwise, must ensure that there is equity in life-saving interventions, solid commitments not to exclude those in need from recovery efforts, including economic recovery, and greater support for the often forgotten work of community-level responders. This must include a firm commitment to preparedness at all levels of society, including at the community level, and equitable access to testing, vaccines, and treatment for all at greatest risk. We must also ensure that health and emergency staff and volunteers are supported to operate safely, to provide life-saving aid and access communities in need. And we must guard against the economic ruin of the poorest and most vulnerable as a result of pandemic responses. As mandated by the state party to the Geneva Conventions, and with our experience in supporting states to develop and implement disaster law and policy around the world, IFRC and our members stand ready to provide our expertise and advice to governments and to support a pandemic treaty to not only be powerful on paper, but transformative in reality. Excellencies, distinguished representatives, dear colleagues, I will stop here and then let the panelists take over, but allow me to say this in closing. Let's make sure our legacy is that we applied the lessons of the past and present to shape our future. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chapagan. Very inspiring remarks and excellent introduction to our panel. I'm sure that what you said will be echoed by many of the panelists. I understand that you will have to leave us soon because you have other commitment, but thank you so much for introducing our panel discussion. So we move now to the panel discussion, and we have an excellent group of 4 speakers. I will introduce them in turn. They will each speak for about 10-12 minutes, and then based on the statements, maybe I'll ask a couple of follow-up questions to start a bit of the conversation. Maybe they can have questions for one another. And then we will open up to questions from the audience. So we have a chat. I trust that also the audience can ask questions through the chat. Otherwise, I would appreciate it if the technical support for the webinar could project the questions from the audience into the chat, and I will pass them on to the panelists. So without any further ado, let me start. And our first speaker is Steve Solomon, who is a principal legal officer at the WHO in Geneva and leads the team in the legal office on international, constitutional, and global health law matters. He focuses on governance and international health law. Right now, obviously, he must be working flat out on response to COVID, including the discussions on a possible future pandemic treaty. Prior to joining WHO, Steve was a deputy legal counselor at the US mission in Geneva, focusing in particular on human rights and humanitarian law and negotiating instruments in these two areas. And before that, he was an attorney in the legal office of the State Department in Washington, focusing, as I understand, in good part on the same issue: human rights, arms control, and humanitarian law. So, Steve, you had the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Gianluca. And first, let me say what a privilege it is to be joining you at this webinar. Thanks to the government of Thailand, to all the organizers. And just following on the remarks of the Minister and the Secretary General, the reality is it's just commentary at this point, because the themes that they both spoke about, the themes of equity, really are the sum and substance here. So all I can hope to do is complement with some more granularity, and maybe I would propose that three sort of parts to what I'll say in the next 10 minutes. First, I thought it would be useful just from the practical procedural perspective to share what the state of play is, what we expect to happen over the next really just 6 weeks before the special session. Secondly, I thought I would look a bit more in detail at some of the key themes that have come up in the discussions so far for what a new agreement, a new instrument might look at. And finally, I thought I'd conclude with what I call the 3 C's that may help frame the overarching objectives that would serve this principle of equity. And those 3 C's, just to get to jump to that punchline, but I'll explain them more at the end, are cooperation, coherence, and creativity. But I thought I'd conclude with that. So with that, let me just briefly go over what the state of play is. As has already been referred to, we are looking forward on November 29th to a 3-day special session of the World Health Assembly. Now, this is only the 2nd special session in the history of the organization. It is the first special session that will deal with the substantive matter. So it's a rarely used feature of the Constitution, and I think it indicates the universal concern of member states that we are living at a historic inflection point, which requires resort to mechanisms like a special session mechanism that can address collectively, with all 194 countries involved, the concerns that have been raised and through the experiences that we've all had with the pandemic. I should say that the special session is called special, but in terms of its powers under the Constitution, its normative powers under the Constitution, it is the same as any other session of the Health Assembly. It has the full powers of any other special session. So these 3 normative tools available to it are to address itself to establishing conventions or agreements in the area of health, address itself to establishing regulations in the field of health, which are also would be legally binding, like the IHR 2005 is legally binding, and addressing itself to recommendations on any matter within the mandate of the organization. So those are the normative tools. Specifically, the agenda for this special session is set. It's going to have 1 issue and 1 issue only. And that is to consider the benefits of a convention, agreement, or other instrument with respect to pandemic preparedness and response. What that means as a practical matter is there's a whole lot of work being done in the run-up to this, almost a preparatory conference kind of work, with a working group on strengthening WHO that has been tasked with providing a report, and this is a member state working group, countries, tasked with providing a report to the special session on this question of potential benefits of an instrument. It is expected that with that report, there will be proposals for a decision to be adopted at the special session. And there are different views on what that decision might do. There's a lot of suspense here, so stay tuned. Many of you are involved who may be listening to this. There's a robust amount of work being done by this member state working group. led by its six-member bureau. And not only informal meetings of the working group, but in a series of what they call deep dives to address some of the themes that I'm going to turn to now. So essentially, state of play is special session of the Health Assembly, end of November, 3 days. Question is, what will they decide, if anything, with respect to the consideration of the benefits of an instrument on pandemic preparedness and response? So let me then jump to the sort of 10 themes thematically, which have been discussed. And a number of these themes have come out when the working group has considered the questions of the international health regulations, the 2005 regulations, which is, as I said, legally binding on all states parties. By the way, it has 196 states parties, 2 more than the number of WHO member states, because it's open to all countries. When looking at the IHRs, there has been concern that in some ways, a number of ways, they have fallen short. And these areas, I think, could be collectively grouped into a list of 10 themes where more or less there are things missing from the IHRs in particular, but from the global cooperative system for preparing for and responding to pandemics. So those 10 things, and I'll run through them very briefly and then get to my conclusion. But probably first and foremost, among those 10 things, and here I have to nod to our moderator, Jean-Luc Berchi, who presented on this matter to the working group. Probably number 1 on that list of 10 things is accountability and compliance for the norms relevant in this area, but particularly the norms established by the IHR. So in terms of accountability and compliance, the IHRs have a rather thin provision on this issue. There is an article in the IHR which deals with the issue of interpretation and application of the IHRs, but it has not been well used. It essentially says the Health Assembly shall determine that. There is not the accountability and compliance in the ways that many have talked about it with the joint external evaluations, those other systems for accountability and compliance. Second thematic area is on information provision and cooperation among states. Also, this is an area where there has been concern that the IHRs, which address this, but there's been concern that the way they address it may not go far enough. In particular, there are provisions in the IHR which require provision of information, but it's loosely defined what that information should include. It doesn't necessarily include, for example, as a matter of legal obligation, it doesn't necessarily include genetic sequence data. I'll talk more about the importance of that in a minute. There are provisions in the IHR for international cooperation, including with respect to technology transfer, other issues. That is an area of the IHR, it's Article 44 if you want to take notes, which has probably not fulfilled the expectations that might have been surrounding it. The third area where there was a sense of something is missing is an all-of-government approach. The IHRs are a central instrument, but they're an instrument that is largely managed by ministries of health, not extending to other ministries of the government and not extending to the many stakeholders in the space of pandemic preparedness and response. The fourth theme is, and again of enormous importance, many have pointed to this, is a One Health approach. This is to the importance of looking at issues of zoonotic risk, the issues of animal, human, and planetary health in a holistic way, in a way that's connected so that risks that are posed in respect of all of these different elements can be best managed. Fifth missing theme is financing. The IHRs, of course, do not have a financing mechanism. There is a more broadly with respect to pandemic preparedness and response, there is a continuing difficulty with a cycle of panic and neglect for financing. Clearly, this creates issues, particularly when it comes to pandemic preparedness, where preparedness depends on sustained, systematic maintenance of community and country level health systems. Sixth issue would be issues of structural governance. For 3 minutes for pandemic preparedness and response. Thanks, Gianluca. And here the issue is no real conference of the parties for the IHRs and the importance of developing communities that support broad stakeholder communities. Seventh, there is a missing sense of a pandemic approach generally. The IHRs don't define the word pandemic. That's, and pandemics, as we've seen, present issues very different from outbreaks that the IHR was managed prior to this pandemic. Eighth is a human rights approach. This is briefly mentioned in the IHR, but it is not elaborated. And there is little by way of implementation of what the IHR and the Constitution speak of in terms of human rights. Ninth, equity, which has already been mentioned. And here we have to mention not only the access to the countermeasures in real time for everyone everywhere based on public health needs, but access to the production capacity at the regional, national level to achieve necessary levels of all countermeasures. Finally, the 10th thing is future-proofing of all of this. There is the pace of development with synthetic biology, information technologies, artificial intelligence is such that there needs to be a collective way of future-proofing this. So the 3 C's, cooperation, coherence, and creativity. Here the issue is, we have seen instead of cooperation, too often competition for resources, for supplies, for therapeutics. With coherence, we have seen too much fragmentation. And in terms of creativity, creativity can serve both those objectives, particularly if it is a function of political will. The risk of an absence of creativity is business as usual. And I think as we've heard from the Minister and the Secretary General, there is a need now to look at things differently. The WHO Constitution has tools for doing so. These tools are developed by member states, and member states will make the decisions on this. The tools that they have at hand are masterfully drafted in their constitution. Thanks very much all. Thanks, Gianluca, for the keying on the timing, and very much looking forward to the further discussion on this.
Thank you, Stephen. Apologies for putting some pressure on the timing, but I guess it's my job. Anyway, excellent points. I love these 10 points. I love the creativity. So I hope that this will come up also in the panel, but I think it's essential. People have been talking about Bretton Woods moment, existential moment, once in a century, once in a lifetime. So I think the political and diplomatic creativity should match the rhetoric of how exceptional this moment is. So that's an excellent point. So our next speaker is Viviana Munoz-Tellez. I hope I'm pronouncing it semi-right. Viviana is a coordinator of the Health, Intellectual Property and Biodiversity Program at the South Center. The South Center is a very important organization. Not everybody knows it, but it's really an intergovernmental think tank of developing countries. So it's quite a unique international organization. Dr. Munoz-Tellez is a multidisciplinary policy expert, in particular on public health, intellectual property, and innovation, with 15 years of international experience. She has a master in development management from the London School of Economics and a PhD in management of technology from EPFL, Lausanne. So one of the big incubators of innovation and creativity, to go back to what Steve was saying, certainly in Switzerland and beyond Switzerland. So Viviana, up to you.
Thank you very much, Gianluca. Thank you very much for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Thailand for this invitation. And I'm very honored to be part of this panel. I really look forward to our discussions and to learning from other panelists and to exchange views. So first of all, let me just note I'll be speaking on my personal capacity, and my views don't necessarily represent the views of any of the South Center member states. I think we are having a very important discussion here, which is really about the contribution of international health law to how can the world be better prepared to respond to future pandemics, and importantly, to avoid repeating the mistakes that have been made in the COVID-19 response. So really acknowledging the limitations, and not just of COVID, but also what we've learned in previous outbreaks and how we've dealt with health emergencies of global concern. So what is the driving force behind the ongoing discussion of the need for a pandemic treaty? As was mentioned by Stephen eloquently, countries are undertaking a process of reviewing how did we fare in global preparedness and response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And within this whole review, one of the particular aspects is what is the role that global health law can play in ensuring that we're better prepared and respond more effectively. And very importantly, that it's approach that's guided from the health principles or human health rights principles that are enshrined in the WHO. So on this, I'd like to offer some reflections. First of all, just to recall again some of the essential difficulties, the challenges in the current pandemic response. And of course, one of them being that we've had very stark inequities. So we have to recognize there's very different levels of capacities of countries, both in preparedness and also in response. So the inequity in vaccine access is one of the most stark inequities, but there's many more. We've had insufficient global coordination on many areas, cooperation as well, and on the principle generally of having solidarity, recognizing these different levels of capacities and ensuring that all parts of society are included effectively. As was mentioned prior, the competition among states is not what we'd like to see in situations where we have significant health emergencies. And we've seen this in the case for access to vaccines, as well as in other essential medical countermeasures. And we've seen that interest from the trade arena or political interests have been taking center stage in driving different interventions rather than focusing on interventions on maximizing global public health. And in particular, the market-driven nature of certain transactions with regards to private sector interventions shows that there has been some failure to regulate the private sector, which is an important partner, but we need to ensure that we have governments driving in the global response to pandemics. And another key point is that key guidance from the WHO, which is our global coordinating agency, in particular for norms and other forms of guidance and regulations. Some of them exist very importantly, and some have been developed as we go along and the problems arise, but many of these have not been followed through. So again, I'd like to highlight the point that really human rights needs to be at the center. It's enshrined in the WHO Constitution, where it specifies that we all are seeking to promote the right to health of everyone everywhere. So that is fundamental. Second, we need to get coordination and cooperation among governments back to the center stage of pandemic preparedness and response, and not only to cooperate with, but also to regulate non-state actors. And there, I mean in particular private sector activity. The WHO has key mandates and tools already, but many of these are lacking enforcement. So that is one of the key issues, that it does not have enough teeth as what we might see in other instruments, legal instruments, for example, in the trade area. So of course, significant discussion is ongoing on strengthening the international health regulations, which is one of the few and key tools that we have of mandatory nature within the World Health Organization in this area. So of course, it is very important to strengthen compliance with this, but also there's also guidance of the WHO Secretariat and from the Director General that has been issued during this pandemic, which has been really important, but it has not been followed. And I think that's important to highlight when we think about what needs to be done to avoid these mistakes in the future. For example, the WHO suggested a fair and equitable allocation mechanism for vaccines at the point where we have very limited global supply. And that fair allocation mechanism was to ensure that countries would reach at least 20% of capacity with vaccine doses, so that essential populations, in particular health workers and those that have more vulnerabilities, would be vaccinated. And what we've seen is that a few countries have gone ahead, increasing vaccination rates for their populations, which has affected the capacity, given the short supply of resources worldwide, to vaccinate even for core populations in other countries. And this should be completely unacceptable as global response to a pandemic. So here we did have the guidance, but it was not followed. So I think this point about strengthening the capacity of our leadership in the World Health Organization during pandemic time is also important to consider. We also had, for example, and continue to have the calls from the Director General for a moratorium of booster doses because we are so low in vaccination in some countries, but this has not been heard. The same in the sense of supporting the multilateral mechanism that would ensure furthering access to vaccines and other medical countermeasures in low and middle income countries. We see that this mechanism has been unable to fulfill its mandate because of unilateral measures that are being taken by governments. And we have not had an adequate response to this. But we have now the time to reflect on that and prepare so that we don't see this happening for the next pandemic. I think another related point is a very important work that's happening in a member state work in WHO on sustainable financing. So the WHO is the key agency for technical assistance, not just normative guidance, for many low and middle income countries. So this core source of technical assistance really depends also of its capacity for financing. And WHO has been largely financed now in a manner that does not ensure its sustainable resources for the core areas of its work, including assisting member states in pandemic preparedness and response. So this should also be beared in mind that we really need to support that financial sustainability of WHO for this area and overall so that it can have a key leading role. Again, I think on AHR strengthening that has already been mentioned, but an important element is that Article 44, as was mentioned previously by Stephen, it has a best effort on collaborating among member states to the extent possible to detect and respond to health crises and to share technical and legal financial support. But this has not been implemented in a way that we saw now. And this did not kick in a way that substantially increased global collaboration for implementation by HR, and therefore shows again the reliance really on WHO core capacity in this area. Now, coming to the issue of ensuring timely and equitable access to diagnostics, vaccines, medicines, protective equipment, and other medical technologies, I'd like to note that most WHO members agree that this is something fundamental that needs to be worked upon. Now, the issue is, how will we do this? Will we agree to what are particular measures that need to be taken? So I'd like to offer some ideas on what should be part of the content for ensuring fair and equitable access. So one of them, of course, is that we need substantial cooperation during contexts when we have global supply shortages. So therefore, that this recognition that individual actions by a single government can unduly affect and unfairly affect then capacities of others. In the context of health emergencies as well, we need to promote innovation in a way that facilitates rapid technology and know-how diffusion. There has been significant levels of taxpayer investment going to private sector for basic research, for clinical trials, for manufacturing, as well as ensuring markets by advanced purchases. So industry has not let alone this area of innovation. It has been really public-private partnerships. And this means that governments have to step up in disciplining the private sector in this engagement. There's the ability to leverage the power of governments by financing research and development and in the purchase of vaccines and other medical countermeasures in order to push the private sector to share more broadly know-how and technology. And here we need to give attention to the potential access conditions that governments can tie in their procurement contracts and in advanced purchasing commitments. But we need cooperation among governments on these elements. Otherwise, clearly, as we have seen in the current pandemic, then it goes to the lowest common denominator. And we've allowed the market dynamics to drive on access when it should be governments clearly doing so. There's also the ability to limit non-disclosure in agreements. So confidentiality aspects also as an important element of ensuring more dissemination of technology and its diffusion. Now, there is an important potential for nonprofit innovation with more collaboration among, for example, public research institutions and more global R&D collaboration. And the example of nonprofit partnerships being very effective in other areas could be already scaled up in this area. It's also important to recognize that intellectual property rights can be barriers to the rapid knowledge transfer. Now, some governments have said that we can rely on voluntary licensing, but this means it's in the hands of the private sector to decide conditions for access. That is very problematic. So we think that we need to also go beyond that. And this is why there's also proposals to ensure that this is done in the trade area, but is part of this discussion in WHO. It'll be very important also to ensure that we can address measures that member states can take, for example, to use fully the flexibilities allowed in the agreements in the trade area on intellectual property to promote public health. And this is fully consistent with implementation of similar agreements. And this would really support response to health emergencies, even in the preparedness stage, so that we could facilitate and swiftly use these mechanisms once we need them. We also need cooperation in controlling prices. For example, in the case of vaccine prices, they're taking very high toll in developing country health budgets, which means they have less ability to address other core issues, for example, of the shortage of health workers and other important areas that need support. Now, another area is also ensuring that we have more transparency in clinical trials, also cooperation here, on government contracts for research and development and the scale of public financing provided, of government purchase agreements, so on quantities, on the prices and the delivery timelines. And importantly, this has been one of the factors that has really affected the operation of the multilateral mechanism for pooling procurement to then facilitate access to low and middle income countries. Other issues, as I mentioned, on pricing, ensuring that we have clarity on what are the private R&D investments as that trade-off of how we also ensure that we have knowledge diffusion. And also consider more fully sharing information and scaling up that public financing for research and development, including on not-profit models of subsidies, tax exceptions, and other mechanisms that are used to stimulate research and development and transfer of technology. So I think I'll stop there, and I really look forward then to our interaction and more specific questions. Thank you very much, Gianluca.
Thank you so much, Viviana. So I'm surprisingly, you focus a lot on the biggest elephant in the room, I think, in the negotiation on the treaty and any normative instruments, how to ensure equity, not only equity, but sort of everything that goes from clinical trial to management of intellectual property to the relation between public and private sector. And it would be interesting also if others have views, how can all this be regulated in a treaty? Can it all be part of a package? Can only be part of this sort of fit in a treaty and other parts elsewhere? That I think there is an issue also of architecture, of how certain commitments, where do they belong, how can they be better expressed and so on. But in my view, that's probably the biggest and most difficult element in negotiating a treaty which is not only effective, but also equitable. So I'm sure there will be also, I hope, a question from the audience. Let me move to a third speaker now. It's Frank Mohauer. He's a director of the National Society Policy and Knowledge Development Department of the IFRC. Frank is a lawyer from the University of Cologne and Lausanne. He's been working in the IFRC since 2000 as a legal officer at the beginning, and he moved there from the German Red Cross legal department. So he has a very long experience in the field of humanitarian action and in particular the IFRC. So without further ado, Frank, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Gianluca, and Excellencies, distinguished colleagues and friends. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. For specific reasons. One is that in my career which you just highlighted there, when I moved here to Geneva, one of my first tasks I was given was to develop a tool which we called at that time the International Disaster Response Law tool, which was coming out of the need from our operational people who said, we are having problems of getting relief items from one country to another country. We also have problems within the countries. And so we started in 2000 thinking about what kind of tools we can have treaty was a part of that, but we then opted for the option of guidelines and providing guidelines of domestic implementation. And why did we do this? Because disaster response is the bread and butter of the IFRC and its 190 national societies. And this is where all what we're doing is based on our activities and our practice and our experiences here. And just also to let you know why we have been doing this and starting this is also that our 192 national societies, they are not NGOs in the classical sense. They are also not governmental institutions. There's a sui generis right in the middle between them. We call them their auxiliaries to the public authorities in the humanitarian field. And they are recognized by the authorities that they have this privileged status in a country. And that is that they have a better access and are part of the disaster management tools, but also having access to governments and to parliaments to advise them on the various necessary disaster laws which exist and what we are suggesting they should be implementing. And so with other words, they are the ideal connection between the communities, knowing what is happening. Our 14 million volunteers are there in the communities, reaching out, working with the communities, and the authorities on the other side. So this link between from the governmental side to the communities. And that, interestingly, and my Secretary General alluded to this, in 1919, when one was looking at the influenza at that time, there was a conference in Cannes where people were discussing of how to gather information from the community level to the scientific community and to analyze this and push out information from the scientific community back down to the communities on behaviors, on precaution measures, etc. And here it was very quickly clear that the National Red Cross, Red Crescent societies can play this role, and the then league was created, and which is now the IFRC, to coordinate this mechanisms. So as I already said, is that the disaster law program, we founded this about 20 years ago, and it is specifically we have received a specific mandate by the state parties to Geneva Conventions and from our members, national societies in the international conference, to roll this out and to do more research and to provide guidance to governments through our national societies. And most recently, this was even emphasized again in the last international conference in 2019. We had a specific resolution on epidemic and pandemics to specifically urge states to take care of this. And we have to say this was December 2019, when we were starting to hear that something was going on around the pandemic, and also to make sure that governments are connecting with the communities through the national societies in case there is a pandemic. Today, we are regulating through this disaster law program quite a lot of different issues, from relief items going across borders, personnel going across borders, goods, alert mechanisms, early warning systems, border and customs closures, and also the coordination within different authorities in countries. So here we are now, 20 years later, after we started this very domestic focused law program. 20 years later, we are looking at the epidemic and pandemics of COVID, and we must say that we have not learned much. Our volunteers did not know whether they were able to move when there were closures. They were also, when we had curfews, they could not do their normal activities. They could not go to the communities. We also were not able to deliver relief items, even if we had them in stock, because border closures did not allow us to bring them to other countries. We were also not able to have our normal sending of our staff to other countries to assist in these areas, because they were also not allowed to travel. And based on these realities, we started a study. We initiated a study in March 2020 on mapping the emergency decrees of more than 100 countries at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and to better understanding how domestic legal and institutional frameworks supported or hampered the respective responses in the given countries. And this is the study I'm having here, and we're very happy to provide them all to you. I think we also have an online version which we can share. We know, of course, from our operations, interaction with governments, that there were issues, and I just described some of them. But the study showed us that there were very specific ones which are quite interesting, because they're also interesting because they underpin of all what we've heard, what a potential treaty can be. So first of all, one of the things is that one of the findings is that many countries had completely outdated and old laws in there. So we have seen some were from the 1800s or the 1900s. So they were over 100 or 200 years old, which means issues like One Health approach was not existing. They were targeting illnesses like smallpox, which are not prevalent anymore. The other part is that risk reduction and recovery is also not part of these disaster laws. And we all know that effective management of health biological hazards can prevent some PHS from occurring in the first place, and comprehensive recovery programs are essential in large-scale pandemics like the ones we are still experiencing. Another issue which we found was, which is not much regulated there, is, and Stephen mentioned this as well, very restricted to health departments, to health ministries, even in each country. So completely leaving away that there are other ministries and other departments are part of it. Also including how other actors, such as the National Red Cross, Red Crescent societies, can play a role in these parts, in the decision-taking, in the rollout of the decisions, but also in getting in the consultation processes and what is the best way forward. Let alone to speak about private sector, NGOs, and whatever. All these domestic laws which we have been looking at are very, very thin on these parts. And another big issue is for sure coordination, which is lacking completely within countries because they are not mentioned in these laws. So if you don't mention them, they don't exist in legal terms, so you don't coordinate them, but also the coordination amongst ourselves within in the international area. So these are some of the overarching issues we found in this research: outdated frameworks, overall narrow scope, no risk reduction or recovery, and very narrow scope of the actors, which do not reflect the reality. So I don't want to bore you more about this part, and I really recommend to read it. It's 170 pages big, but there's two big areas which I would like to drill down a little bit more. One is the early warning and early action. We must ensure that early warning and early action is not only an international obligation, but that it is also early warning and early action in the communities, because that is what is currently completely lacking as an international binding instrument. And we all know that if we do not warn early, if we don't not take early action, the diseases spread in a tremendous speed. The impact of border closures and travel restrictions on human mobility. It is about the normal father who can't go back anymore. The mother cannot go back into the country anymore. It is about relief personnel cannot travel, but it's even more impactful on marginalized groups or on asylum seekers or on refugees who cannot go across the countries, and that can be partly also life-threatening for them. And as I said, these findings are all very much domestic related, but they are reflecting what is the reality. And a global treaty is really the instrument which can pull these things together and make them legally binding everywhere in all countries. So that is really why we also think and believe that a legal treaty in that level can pull these things together, because it will set some standards and initiatives, and also make sure that states adhere to these parts. And this is actually why we're here today, to discuss this legal treaty, but we must not forget what the reality is on the ground. And we also have to make sure that any treaty needs domestic implementation in one point and the other one. 2 more minutes. Okay, very well. So there's 2 big areas which we need to spend also more time on. That is, one is the community health systems. They need to be also somehow recognized. And that is very important to build trust to the communities. We know, we've seen this during Ebola. We've seen this now in the hesitancy. If people do not trust, we have problems. They don't listen. So the community-based approach is extremely important. We need to invest in the community healthcare systems. We also can see now, even if vaccinations goes up and we have vaccines available, we have to get them into people's arms. And that is becoming more and more of an issue. So we need to invest in this last mile outline. And the second one, it was mentioned already several times, is the inequality of the availability, because I will make it very short. I have a long paragraph here, but one paragraph says it all. No one is safe until everyone is safe. And that is the key here. We from the Federation, as my Secretary General already said, we are very happy to support this treaty, bringing our expertise, legal expertise, but based on our experience on the ground. And I will stop here, and thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank. Also, in your case, quite a number of important issues. And I would like to underline something that we've been hearing a lot: trust. The absence of trust between countries, and I think Viviana spoke eloquently to a level of justified mistrust that many developing countries have in what to do about a equitable access that has just not happened, but also trust within the community. We've seen protests in the street in a peaceful and rather sort of normally conciliatory country like Switzerland, crowds trying to enter the federal building in Bern. So that's a generalized issue that has to be addressed. And in particular, can a treaty be an instrument to rebuilding trust, and how so? So I hope that we'll have some views about this. Before giving the floor to Dr. Villawan, let me remind the audience that I understand you have access to the chat. And so if you have questions, please, I would strongly encourage you to write them in the chat, and then we'll pose them to our panelists. So our final speaker is Dr. Villawan Mangkla-Tanakul. She's the Director General of the Department of Treaties and Legal Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Thailand. Dr. Villawan is a career diplomat with over 25 years of experience, in particular in very important areas of international law like diplomatic and state immunities, treaty law, intellectual property, and international economic law. I think Dr. Villawan is particularly expertise in international economic law. She has participated in negotiating bilateral investment treaties, free trade agreements, but also advocating for the interests of developing countries in multilateral questions like the reform of the investor-state dispute settlement system, in UNCTAD, in UNCITRAL, and in other fora. And as Ambassador Tongpak reminded us, Dr. Villawan has been nominated by the government of Thailand as a candidate for the International Law Commission for the term 2023-2027. And she will be Thailand's first woman candidate to this important position. I understand the election will take place in the General Assembly probably next month in November during the International Law Week, and so that will be definitely an important moment. Dr. Villawan, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Bushi. Before I begin, let me express my sincere appreciation for everyone that are here today and those are involved in organizing this very important webinar today. So as you all already said, that this COVID-19 has given us a lot of thoughts, of what we are going to do next, when there is other pandemics coming to us. So this COVID-19 has been caused disruption both domestically and internationally. Its impact on economic front is comparable to the 1930s Great Depression, I would say. And the pandemic also raised a lot of questions that's on the broad spectrum, not only the health issues, but also on the vaccine distribution, on restriction of cross-border trade, and on the protection of fundamental rights and human rights of people. So I think this issue, there is no doubt among us that this issue need to be considered by international community. And definitely the concurring discussion now in New York at the 76th session of the UNGA, and also the upcoming discussion under WHO in the late November is the evidence that this problem cannot be tackled by any single state. We need international cooperation to deal with this problem. So if we look back at the history, we see each global disruption always follow with the international effort to solve the problem. So we're trying to prevent the history from repeating itself. Again, with this pandemic, we try to find some way to prevent future disaster that we are going to face. So, I mean, for example, we have found the League of Nations after World War I. We have UN, United Nations, after World War II. So whether we will have a treaty after these pandemics, I think it's up to the international community to look at these issues. For me, I don't have the preference, I have to say first, but I think whichever a form of the cooperation that we have will always good and definitely will help us, especially for a country like us, developing and every country to handle this situation. So, but whatever the form of these instruments or cooperation will be, it should address some of the issues. In my view, the following issue that need to be addressed in this instrument or whatever form it will take. First of all, it should empower the current system and legal frameworks, especially the IHR of 2005. It has been speak already that IHR has been using by all member states in tackling this problem. Thailand also have our domestic law complying with the IHR, and we follow when we deal with this pandemic with the guidelines that are provided for us in the IHR 2005. So I think that should be upheld. And definitely, secondly, it should reinforce the leading role of the WHO, because IHO is a body that already done on this and done a very good job on this, and that should be reinforced and maybe empower more of the WHO for member states. And thirdly, I think it should expand the best practices, such as a very good example of humanitarian buffer provided by the COVAX facility to ensure that the most vulnerable and including humanitarian settings be protected and get access to COVID-19 vaccine. I think that's the element that should be upheld as well. And the fourth element, I think it should boost synergy between key domestic and international players. It has been mentioned already by Viviana and also Frank as well, that the domestic implementation is very important, because the government level, we adhere to international obligations, but at the domestic or at the locality, whether that fulfill the obligation or not. So I think that's something that we should have in this element. And the last element is that it should go a step beyond the existing rules and regulations to ensure other things like fair and inclusive vaccine distribution, prevent disruption in the supply chain. And as has been said already by Mark, that no one is safe until everybody is safe. So with this, I think we must ensure that in the time of pandemics, the international community, including countries with less capacity and fewer resources, will be better prepared and can give better response and can recover faster after the pandemic. And it's also that individuals who often fall out of the scope of legal protection, like women who live in the poverty, migrants, children, and disabled people, persons, will be better protected. I think that should be an element. As we already mentioned that with ILC candidature of mine, so I obliged to speak something about ILC on this today. I think ILC is an independent body of experts with experience and clear mandates on the progressive development of law. So I think ILC can render expertise and service to the to complement the ongoing work with the WHO. Article 17 of the ILC statute states that ILC shall consider proposal and draft multilateral conventions submitted by members of the UN, the UN principal organs, and other than General Assembly, specialized agencies like WHO or official bodies established by international governmental agreement to encourage the progressive development of law and its codification. I'm aware that the issue of international law in relation to pandemics has been brought up both in the ILC and in the Sixth Committee a couple of years ago, in the last 2 years. But it has not been accepted as an agenda yet. But I mean, if member state or specialized agencies recognize the importance or necessity of the issue, it could propose the ILC to provide an in-depth and comprehensive legal study, identify legal gaps, and propose legal principle and solution based on the safe practice. I think that could be a way for that, so you don't have to wait for ILC to start the work. Relevant agency can ask for expertise. The reason that I suggest that because the ILC has completed its work on the protection of persons in the event of disaster in the form of draft articles in 2016. Whichever form of the cooperation on pandemics we take, I think it should embrace some of the principles that already stated in such a draft article. Let me mention some of them. Firstly, on respect and protection of human dignity. In draft article 4, respect and protection of human rights in draft article 5. The principle of non-discrimination and the exception of needs to address particularly vulnerable groups that are also in the draft. And the duty of affected states to cooperate and seek assistance, external assistance. I think we have been talking about cooperation and assistance from outside the country. I think that is very important. And it's already set the guidelines in the draft article. And this is in line with international instruments, including the UN Charter, the Declaration on Principle of International Law concerning friendly relations and cooperation, Article 11.1 of International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and Article 19A of the Sendai Framework of Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 and 2020. So these are the rules that's already embodied in other instruments, and it should be taken into account when we are considering drafting the legal issue. So let me conclude by this part by saying that it is very clear that no single government or institution can tackle this problem of the pandemics alone. International community definitely will benefit from international solidarity and cooperation from all relevant players, from government to international organization to private sector or NGOs that are working on this. And I hope ILC will be one of the organ that can help render their hands in this, completing with international rules on pandemics. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dr. Villawan. More issues to discuss, and you preempt a question that I had on what you thought could be the role of the International Law Commission in this field. So I'm very happy you dealt with it. So academia has a role to play. So as you know, the International Law Institute, the Institut de Droit International, met recently online and adopted a resolution on epidemics, pandemics, and international law. And also the International Law Association has a committee on international health law that has presented a report at the last conference, and there was a resolution adopted by it, largely based on what international law can do to prevent and to respond to a pandemic. So in a way, we have a role for governments, for international organizations, for civil society, but also for academia, I think, to help us think through and try to build the creativity that Steve was talking about. So I see we have one question from the audience. I hope there will be more. But if you don't mind, I'd like to have a quick couple of follow-up questions and invite you to give me fairly short answers so we leave space for questions from the audience. My first question is to Frank. So the IFRC has a tremendous experience in disaster law, in disaster law preparedness. I sort of a bit of a superficial knowledge, but it's very impressive, in particular how pragmatic you are on the things that should happen at a national level to avoid the hurdles, unnecessary obstacles in the provision of assistance. But what about a pandemic? Is that a disaster, like an earthquake, like a tsunami, like the typical things that come to our mind if we think of a disaster? Or is a extreme health event like COVID, like a pandemic, essentially different? They require different instruments for humanitarian assistance, cooperation, for the updating on the national legislation that you were talking about.
I'm neither a disaster expert nor a health expert. I'm a lawyer, so we bridge them. There are for sure differences, but as we have seen also with the Ebola crisis in West Africa, we are applying the same tools in terms of rapid response, of reaching out to people, of gathering the information, of scaling up. And the same is also in the pandemic, and for sure on a different level. An earthquake is a very quick onset disaster, but we also saw that the COVID-19 went faster than we ever have thought it would. So there are a lot of parallels, and when we look into the impediments we are having, are also the same again. So it is about getting people from one to A to B, getting relief goods from A to B. Are you an accredited person in the country? Are you an accredited doctor in the country? Are these medication accredited? We see this everywhere currently. Vaccinations. Not every vaccination is accredited in every country. So there are parallels in this area. So what we've been able to apply our experiences from normal disasters to health emergencies. And because they are very, very quite related. And we have our experiences also with Ebola or with other pandemics, epidemics, which you have there. And the same, people need water, people need sanitation, they need food in these areas. And especially just like in water, we had the key message at the beginning: wear a mask and wash your hands. Not everybody has water left for washing their hands. So getting to people to disinfect their hands and washing their hands is the same as in any other crisis which we had to do and relate to.
Thank you. Excellent. Viviana, Dr. Villawan has mentioned COVAX and ACT-A. You have not mentioned them. So what do you think of these experiences? Because they look like very impressive governance experiments in a scope of 3 months. WHO, other organizations, governments, the private sector, the civil society came together to devise like a big experiment to try to ensure equitable access to countermeasures. Things have gone sometimes well, sometimes not. But what is your perspective on this? Do you think has been at least the fundamental idea behind it is something valid, something you would replicate in a future treaty or other instrument, something that could be a solution to at least part of the problems we were mentioning before?
Thanks, Gianluca. So I did mention in relationship to talking about the multilateral mechanism for pooling together for purchase of vaccines and other countermeasures, and related to that to reduce the risk, financial risk of governments going on their own way. But of course, this is what's known as the ACT-A accelerator, as you mentioned, and part of that for vaccines is the COVAX. I think what we can highlight as success was the fact that this was a quick setup. It was urgently needed because there was nothing else. And some agencies, all independent agencies, did this very loose collaboration. Some part of it, WHO was involved in co-hosting. Importantly, it was for the allocation mechanism for adequate allocation of vaccines doses. But I think it was positive to see that there was this reaction to cooperate among agencies, and they were, not necessarily within WHO, to try to provide some form of solution to the problem that was expected at that moment already seeing. If we don't have a multilateral response to how to address the issues about access to vaccines and other countermeasures for low and middle income countries, then it naturally won't happen because we are supplying new goods that are essential for all the countries. So clearly there could be the tendency of some countries to go ahead, the wealthier countries first, having first access and potentially then affecting the rest. So I think that was good that there was this reaction. What I think now we have to do is now think about how do we appropriately design institutions more long-term, taking lessons from what we've learned so far, what worked well, and what really could be improved in future. So I think that should be part of the discussion is how do we design and support those institutions to work appropriately, which includes both governance structure, includes financing, it includes the related rules that I mentioned that if you have this other track whereby unilaterally or regionally countries are buying up the full supplies by pre-purchase commitments, then the multilateral mechanism is not the first option. It becomes the back of the queue for its own procurement, and that makes it very difficult for other countries to have adequate and equitable access. So institutionalizing those processes through whatever processes come forward now in this discussion would be important. Thanks.
And that's some of the proposals. The IPPR, the Independent Panel on Pandemic Preparedness and Response, that let's institutionalize ACT-A and COVAX as end-to-end platforms. The challenge would be how do you put it in there is an idea of making it part to a treaty, how to replicate the multi-stakeholder approach if there is a political intention to do it in a legal instrument that normally is open only to states, and do we want to do that? So, but there have been definitely proposals in this sense. I have a quick follow-up question for Dr. Villawan. Several speakers, yourself included, spoke the importance of human rights. Don't let's forget human rights in how we respond and how we prepare for pandemics. And something that personally strikes me is at least in the debate within WHO and around WHO on the possible content of a future treaty, human rights are hardly ever mentioned. We talk about One Health, we talk about countermeasures. Obviously, they're to do with the right to health, but human rights don't seem to be at the center of the discussion. And some people are saying that's wrong. They should be part and parcel of future pandemic treaty. Other people say no, leave it to the UN, leave it to the European Council, leave it to the regional treaties and monitoring bodies. Don't somehow replicate it, duplicate it in a WHO treaty. What do you think about it? Do you think that human rights should be part of a future WHO pandemic treaty, or better leave them to where they belong institutionally?
Yes, I think that question has already arisen when the ILC was drafting the disaster, I would say the disaster convention. I think whether there is a right, of health or to health, as you say it, as a human right. I think the question is solidarity is a right or not. That's what's raised by some of the agencies in that. And I think that question is ongoing because what we are facing is that those in the vulnerable group or in the rural areas or the migrants or as I mentioned, women in the poverties and far away, they cannot get access to this healthcare and soon enough, I mean, because of this, management of distribution. So I think that is something that you need to include, to discuss on that. And I don't know how are we going to address that because, of course, we have enough international instruments on human rights, but we know that enforcing it is another issue. So, and it's the capacity of each member states are not equally the same. Taking the pandemics, I would raise the question that we in Thailand are very good at the very beginning to handle it. But when the situation prolonged to 2 years, I think there is the need for economic recovery, and people need a job, people need the money to take care of their family. So I think we have to compromise between this healthcare and security. And that's why the number of the infection has been going back, from in Thailand. And that's because we cannot go on, lock down the country for the whole time. And we have to protect all these people from poverty as well. And when we are talking about this, since I have the floor, give you some example of the self-help mechanism that we have in Thailand. We know already Thailand is a very community-oriented, in every way. So with this healthcare as well, I think we have solidarity and cooperation in every sector of the healthcare, from ministerial to provincial and to locality. And that is a strong point. We have something apart from the universal health coverage that we have done quite well for Thailand. We also have something that's called village health volunteers, VHV. And this is a group of people that organize, among the villagers or even in Bangkok, in the locality in Bangkok. To date, we have more than 1 million village health volunteers nationwide. They go door to door to provide health education, perform active case finding, disease surveillance. They even, employ the electronic means for people to record their timelines when there is a victim of the pandemics of the COVID-19, and they even making mass cloth when we have the pandemics at the very beginning when we are, in need of that. So a majority of this volunteer, 80% are women, naturally. And I think this is the whole of the society approach that we have to be taken, because their role, they are already close already in their community, and the way that they convince, whether you get vaccine or not get vaccine from the very beginning, that's something that these village healthcare volunteer are of help. So the number of vaccination in Thailand is increasing. We plan to have up to 70%, by the end of the year. So that's with the benefit of, community. So I would say that from the international to the to national, and that's top down, I would say, and you have to build from bottom up as well, and that would be able to handle this situation, in my opinion.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. In particular, the fact that international, national, and local have to work together. Sometimes you have the feeling that human rights are like a top-down, something coming from some abstract entities in Geneva or Brussels or Strasbourg. But obviously, the real action has to happen at the local level. It's amazing that more than 1 million volunteers. So that goes back, I think, what Frank was saying in terms of the community health system, how it's crucial. Whatever happens at the international level, that's how you build a strong system. I had a question for Steve, but I see that there are questions from the audience that I think in partly are addressed to him. So Steve, if you don't mind, I will throw the first question that I see, which is, Member States agree that the world needs to be better prepared and respond to the next pandemics. Ongoing discussions about dual tracks for developing a pandemic treaty and strengthening the IHR concurrently. How the WHO should proceed to ensure that the dual tracks will not be duplicated, I guess, to avoid overlaps and replication. So I know sort of if I put word in your mouth, you're a serving lawyer in WHO, so we all know that we have limits to what we can say. So we fully understand if you can sort of spill your soul, but I'm sure you're the best place to address this point.
Well, thanks, Jean-Luc, and thank you for providing the caveat for me. Very helpful, appreciated. No, I think the importance of this goes to the issue of coherence with the various instruments as well. And it's very clear that member states understand the value of the IHR and preserving them, not backsliding on them, but strengthening them. And if there is to be a new international agreement, a new treaty or instrument that addresses pandemics, making sure that they work synergistically. So, of course, the IHR mentions this in Article 57, but maybe just by way of an example, diplomats and lawyers and politicians and technical people have experience ensuring coherence when systems are developed in light of changes. Best example here is what is called now the GISRIS, the Global Influenza Surveillance and Response System. So GISRIS started in the 1950s as GISIN, Global Influenza Surveillance Network. Then in 2010, there was a breakdown in influenza sharing, clearly a need for access and benefit equity in the the pandemic influenza space. Member states worked with their existing international network, over 120 countries' labs participate in this, and said, we've got to improve, strengthen this global influenza network. We got to build a PIP, pandemic influenza preparedness framework. We got to improve DISIN, make it GISRIS, and there was coherence. So there is, I guess this is just to say, there's experience not only in this sort of by analogy to developing these global systems, but specifically in the health space.
So that's a best case scenario that the member states can ensure this synergy and not duplicating. And I must say, I don't know what will happen, yes. But yeah. From a rational choice perspective, I'm personally, that's my own personal opinion, almost hope that will be the outcome of the assembly, somehow having these two parallel tracks that can look at each other and try to not step on each other's toes, but ensure the synergy that you were talking about. So we have about 6 minutes to go, and there's a question that I think I would like to raise the first questions, actually, maybe for Frank and for Dr. Villawan. So when the pandemics like COVID-19 occur, the most affected and left behind are likely to be the most vulnerable groups. That's a theme that is recurring in all our statements, and it's empirical evidence in front of our eyes. How could we ensure that vulnerable groups, in particular women and girls, be better empowered through a legally binding instrument? So that goes in part back to my question on human rights, but beyond. So it cannot be just a technocratic instrument that look at sort of pharmaceuticals and as important as they can be and pathogen sharing, but they really need to touch some of the bottom lines, and vulnerability is a big bottom line. So what do you think a treaty could do? Dr. Villawan, in part you've already addressed this point, so maybe I'll ask Frank first from his experience in the IFRC on the bottom-up
Yes, that is a very key issue for us in anywhere, and specifically in this area. And empowerment comes also with engagement. So a treaty has to make sure that every group, especially vulnerable groups, no matter where they are, that they are engaged in the planning exercise already in the risk reduction phase, so the preparedness phase, to understand what their special needs are. And then also to listen them in the whole phase, from preparedness over during the crisis and also in the afterward. So for us, it is very much getting them engaged in the processes and reaching out. That provides really empowerment and then also protection in the wider sense. And the treaty can put these principles in place.
Dr. Villawan, do you agree with this point? Do you have a different perspective or something to add?
Yes, I totally agree that we have to address this topic somehow if we're going to have the instrument on this, because as I said, you already seen that majority of women are involved in helping the society, but at the same time, I think the statistics already show that with this COVID-19, women are struggling more. With the work, even professional women work from home, you probably have to take care of the children as well. So I think that the more burden has been putting on women during this pandemics, and especially those in the less income, that would be more of the violence has been recognized as well, that there are more violence, domestic violence, because of the problem of pressure from not having enough money to take care of the family and other problems. So I think those rights of the women we need to be addressed, and also other vulnerable group as well. And I would notice that with the COVAX, I think there is a international NGO that's already asked in the case of Thailand to have the special vaccine available for the migrants and those that are has not been taken care of, and so I think this convention, we're going to have one. We'll have to address that. You have to make sure that international actors, state or non-state or even private, companies, if they're going to help, with the special group, you have to recognize that they can render their help to that specific group as well.
Indeed. Indeed. Thank you very much. So we have 2 minutes to go. I think we have to finish by 4:30. And as usual, I wish we had like 45 more minutes, because obviously questions generate more questions and so on. And that's the beauty of this interaction. If you allow me, I would like to just some buzzword, but not the buzzword, things that to me are coming up from all the statement in no particular order. Equity is coming out loud and clear. we cannot have the scandal of what we are witnessing now, frankly. I think it will break a lot of the whatever is left of multilateralism and the stability of a system of international relations, but also at a human level, it's simply unacceptable from a moral point of view, political point of view. The question of cooperation and coordination has been evoked. Nationalism has to give way. We cannot dream too much, but certainly we need cooperation. Otherwise, as Gutierrez has said, Dr. Tredos has said, we don't come out of it. We have to come out of it together. So it's almost like enlightened self-interest. It's not like wishful thinking. Trust, I repeat it again, because there's a big shortage of trust at the national and international level. Without that, we don't go very far. Vulnerability and human rights, that's come out very well. I think Dr. Villawan, her last statement, has underlined it very well. The question of compliance. Also, Viviana mentioned it, the fact that there has not been much compliance with what WHO has been recommending. Everybody nods, but not much follow-up. How to ensure it? Compliance is not automatic. People are talking about sanctions. We need enforcement. Do we really need that? Or we need different approach to ensure compliance with a treaty or even with the IHR. So many things that had to be discussed at the various levels in WHO, in other international organizations. I would mention the UN, that I think should play a stronger role than it has done until now, in civil society, in organizations like the South Center, that really should be the voice for the Global South, in academia. And I think we, at this different level, I think everybody has to play a role to think, to allow a critical approach to what we are doing, but also to push in the right direction. So with this poetic ending, I think we should we can finish here. Many thanks to the panelists. I think it's been extremely interesting. Again, I wish we had more time. Many thanks to Dr. Villawan. So in Italy, when we want to wish good luck, we say in the mouth of the wolf. That's something that we wish to hunters, no? Because then you kill the wolf. So in the mouth of a wolf for your upcoming election, we wish you all the very best. And many thanks to the panelists and to the Thai mission for organizing this interesting event. Many thanks.